I spent years trying to be the perfect child my family wanted, then I stopped, and suddenly, I was the problem. I was 27 years old, standing in my childhood bedroom, holding a report card from the sixth grade that my mother had kept in a folder labeled Achievements. When I realized she had never once kept anything from a day, I was simply happy. No birthday photos where I was just laughing. No drawings I made for fun. No evidence anywhere in that folder that joy was something she had thought worth preserving. Only proof. Only performance. Only the documented record of a child earning her place at the table, over and over, in case the previous proof expired. I put the folder down. I sat on the edge of the bed. And I thought, with a clarity that felt almost violent in how long it had taken to arrive, I've been auditioning for this family my entire life. And I got the part every single time. And it still was never enough. My name is Elena. I'm 31 years old. I'm a structural engineer from a mid-sized city in Ohio, and I was the perfect child. Not in the way people say it warmly, the way you describe a kid who was polite at dinner and cleaned her room without being asked. I mean it in the clinical, exhausting, fundamental sense. I was a child who had understood, at an age far too young to articulate it, that love in my household was not freely given. It was earned, and I was very, very good at earning it. And the day I stopped, everything I thought I understood about my family rearranged itself into something I had always suspected but had never been willing to see clearly. The architecture of perfect. You have to understand what the architecture looked like from the inside, because from the outside it looked like an ordinary family with a high-achieving daughter, and those two things are not the same. My parents, Irina and Pavel, both first-generation immigrants from Eastern Europe who had built a stable, comfortable life through genuinely extraordinary effort, had a theory about love that they had never stated explicitly and had communicated in every possible implicit way for as long as I could remember. The theory was this: love was the reward for excellence. Approval was something you received after demonstrating that you deserved it. Affection flowed toward achievement the way water flows downhill, naturally, automatically, to the lowest point, which in our house was always the most recent accomplishment. When I got perfect grades, the house was warm. When I placed first at the regional science fair, my mother called her sister, and I could hear the pride in her voice through the wall. When I got into the state honors program in 10th grade, my father took the family out to dinner at the nicest restaurant we had ever been to, and he looked at me across the table with an expression I wanted to live inside forever. When I got a B+ in AP Chemistry, my mother didn't speak to me for most of a week. Not angrily, just quietly, the way a room goes cold, not violently but completely. When I quit the violin at 15 after 4 years of lessons I had never wanted and recitals I had survived rather than enjoyed, my father said, "You don't finish things," and didn't qualify it, and I carried that sentence like a stone for years. I was not abused. I need to say that plainly because this story exists in a space where that confusion is easy, and that confusion is not fair to people who were. My parents fed me and clothed me and paid for my education and worked themselves to near exhaustion to give me opportunities they hadn't had. Their love was real. It was also profoundly conditional. Both of those things were true simultaneously, and holding both of them at once is the work I have spent my late 20s and early 30s learning to do. What conditional love teaches a child, and I mean teaches in the deepest sense, the way you learn to walk or to fear fire in the body rather than the brain, is that the self is insufficient. That who you are when you are not performing is not enough. That underneath the achievements and the grades and the first-place ribbons there is something that has not yet proved its right to warmth, and that the job of your life is to keep it covered, keep it producing, never let it rest. I learned this lesson so thoroughly that by the time I was a teenager, I had nearly forgotten there was a self underneath the performance at all. I was the grades. I was the awards. I was the daughter who never caused problems and always had the answer and never, ever needed anything that couldn't be resolved by working harder. I was a machine for making my parents proud, and I ran efficiently and without complaint, and for a long time, for the better part of 2 decades, I genuinely could not tell you what I actually wanted because I had stopped asking myself the question so many years ago that the question itself had gone quiet. What I gave them. The record of what I gave my family over the years, in pursuit of the particular warmth that came with approval, is long and detailed, and something I can recite the way you recite a memorized poem, flatly at speed, without inflection because the emotion has been sanded off by repetition. I studied engineering not because I had a passion for it, though I was good at it, genuinely good, and came to care about it eventually, but because my father had once said when I was 14 that engineers built real things and real things lasted, and he said it with a reverence that told me it was the right answer. I did not apply to the art program I had quietly researched. I did not tell anyone about the 2 notebooks of short stories I had been writing since I was 12. I chose the right answer, and I pursued it with the full force of a person who had decided that what she wanted was beside the point. I did not move away for college. There were better programs in other cities, and I knew it, and I stayed. When my mother said, "Why would you go somewhere far when you can go somewhere good and be home?" I nodded and treated it as wisdom. I understand now that it was anxiety, wearing the costume of wisdom. But I was 18 and I wanted the warm house, and staying was the price. I dated men my parents approved of. I brought them to Sunday dinners and watched my mother's assessment play out across her face in real time. The small satisfaction when a man had the right kind of job, the faint cooling when something about him didn't compute with her model of what my life should look like. I ended 2 relationships that were actually good because I could feel the temperature in the house dropping around them, and I did not yet have the courage to choose my own warmth over my mother's. I did not tell my family when I was struggling. When I went through a period in my mid-20s of real depression, not dramatic, not crisis level, but the gray, grinding, everything is underwater kind that settles in when you have been performing yourself for 25 years and the performance is taking everything you have. I smiled at Sunday dinners and said things were good and drove home and lay on my couch and felt the specific exhaustion of someone who has been keeping up appearances in every available direction and cannot figure out where to stop. I did not tell them about the therapy I started at 25. Not because I was ashamed, but because I knew, with the certainty of someone who has read the room for decades, that the therapy would be taken as evidence of a problem, and a problem was a performance failure, and a performance failure meant the cold house, and I was not yet strong enough to survive the cold house without flinching. I was a very good daughter. I was an excellent product of my family's expectations, and I was, underneath all of it, deeply and quietly and completely lost. The unraveling. The therapist's name was Dr. Osei. She was calm in a way that I initially distrusted. I had learned to be suspicious of unconditional warmth because in my experience warmth always came with conditions that just hadn't been named yet. She had a plant on her windowsill that I looked at during our first session instead of at her because I wasn't sure what my face was doing, and I didn't want to have to manage it. Over the months that followed, she asked me questions I had not been asked before. Not about my accomplishments, not about my plans, about what I wanted, about what I liked, about what I would choose if choosing had no consequence, about who I was when nobody was watching and nothing was at stake. I discovered in those sessions that I barely knew, and that discovering this was both the saddest and the most important thing that had ever happened to me. The unraveling was not a single moment. It was a series of very small decisions that accumulated into a new direction. I stopped studying for the professional certification I had been grinding toward for a year, a certification I had chosen because it was prestigious rather than because I wanted it. I started writing again in the notebooks for the first time in 10 years. I told a colleague I didn't want to lead the project he was offering me, which was the right project on paper because I was tired and I needed to rest, and for the first time in my life I allowed myself to treat that as a valid reason. I started letting small true things out. I told my mother at dinner one Sunday that I didn't like the dish she had made, warmly, normally, the way a person might mention a preference, and watched her face register this as something she had to process, which told me everything about how far we had to go. I started saying no, quietly, without drama, the way a person says no who has decided that no is a complete sentence and not the beginning of a negotiation. No to the extra hours that had no end point. No to the social obligations I had been attending out of performance rather than desire. No to the second and third and fourth servings of other people's needs that I had always accepted in place of my own. And then I told my parents about the therapy. When the performance stopped, I told them on a Sunday evening in October, at the end of dinner, in the ordinary yellow light of their kitchen. I said it calmly and without pre-apology, which was new. I had always, previously, cushioned the delivery of any potentially unwelcome information with so much reassurance that the actual information got lost. This time I just said it. I had been seeing a therapist for 2 years. I was doing well. I found it useful. I wanted them to know. The silence had a specific texture. My mother looked at the table.
My father looked at me.
Then my mother said, "Why didn't you tell us?" Not a question. A statement carrying the weight of an accusation. I said, "Because I needed it to be mine for a while." She said, "We could have helped." I said gently, "I know you would have wanted to. I needed to help myself." What followed was not a screaming match. My family did not do screaming matches. What it was instead was the quiet, specific, deeply familiar withdrawal. The temperature dropped. My mother became politely distant in the way that she became politely distant when something had disappointed her. My father finished his coffee with the expression of a man recalibrating. And I sat there and felt the old pull, the desperate, conditioned urge to fix it, to soften it, to perform something reassuring that would bring the warmth back. I didn't. I stayed sitting, I stayed quiet, and I let the temperature be what it was. That was the beginning of the end of the performance. And things got harder before they got better. Suddenly, I was the problem. Here is the mechanism I want to explain because I think it is the most important and least discussed feature of families built on conditional love. When the person who has been performing stops performing, the system doesn't understand what to do with them. Because the system was built around the performance. The performance was load-bearing. Remove it, and things shift in ways that nobody in the system asked for or knows how to handle. I was, for most of my life, my family's evidence that they had done it right. That the sacrifices and the pressure and the high expectations had produced a daughter worth being proud of. I was the proof that their theory of love was correct, that if you set the bar high enough and made the rewards conditional enough, the child would rise to meet it, and everyone would flourish. When I stepped back from the performance, I wasn't just making a personal adjustment. I was, from the system's perspective, withdrawing the proof. And a system that has been operating on a certain proof for decades does not respond to the loss of it with curiosity. It responds with alarm. I did not get a promotion I had been offered because I said I wanted to take time to consider whether it was the right direction. And when I mentioned this at dinner, my mother said, "Why wouldn't you take it?" with a worry in her voice that was actually about her, not about me. I told her I wanted to think. She heard. Something is wrong with Elena. I started talking about the writing at dinner, the notebooks, the stories I had been working on quietly for myself because I wanted to and because it made me feel like myself in a way that almost nothing else did. My father listened and said, "And how does that help your career?" I said it wasn't about my career. He said, "Everything you do at your age is about your career." I said I disagreed. He looked at me the way he looked at things that didn't compute. I set a limit around Sunday dinners, not eliminating them, just declining to come every single week because I had been attending every single week for my entire adult life out of obligation rather than desire, and I needed to find out what it felt like to come because I wanted to. When I skipped a Sunday without a compelling excuse, just "I need some time this week." My mother called twice and my father called once, and when I came the following week the room had a specific quality that I recognized as my family's version of a formal complaint. They started talking about me to each other when I wasn't present. I know this because cousins told me, carefully, with the delicacy of people who feel caught in the middle. The narrative being circulated was that Elena had changed. That Elena was being selfish. That Elena had found herself a therapist who was filling her head with ideas. That Elena used to be so grounded, so reliable, so easy, and something had happened to her, and it was a shame. Let me translate that. Elena used to do what we needed. Now she's doing what she needs. This is a problem. The word selfish came up more than once. I want to talk about this word because I think it does a specific and insidious thing in families like mine. In a family built on conditional love, the child's compliance is not recognized as compliance. It is framed as love. The child's self-erasure is not recognized as self-erasure. It is framed as being a good person. And so when the child begins to have a self, When she begins to take up space, to decline, to disagree, to prioritize her own well-being, it doesn't look, from inside the system, like the emergence of a healthy adult. It looks like the withdrawal of love. It looks like selfishness. Because the child's selflessness had been accepted as love for so long that its absence now reads as its opposite. I was not being selfish. I was, for the first time in my life, being a person. But to a system that had never had to accommodate my personhood before, the difference was invisible. The conversation I had been avoiding for 30 years. I asked my mother to have lunch with me. Just us, no Sunday dinner, no full family tableau, just a restaurant and a weekday afternoon, and the conversation I had been rehearsing in various forms since I started therapy. She came dressed as if for an occasion, which told me she had understood this was not a casual invitation. We ordered. We made small talk for approximately 4 minutes, which was how long it took before the weight of the unspoken became unbearable to both of us. I said, I want to talk about what's been happening. Not to argue about it. Just to be honest with you, because I think we haven't been. She set down her water glass. She said, You've been different. I said, I know. She said, You used to talk to us about everything. I said, Mom, I used to tell you the things that made you happy and hide the rest. That's not the same as talking about everything. She opened her mouth. She closed it. I watched her try on several responses and discard them. I said, I need to tell you something that I think is going to be hard to hear, and I'm telling you because I love you, and because I think we're both tired of the version of our relationship we've been having. She said, All right. I said, I spent my whole childhood trying to earn your approval, and I was good at it, but it was never just given to me. And I learned very early that who I was when I wasn't achieving something wasn't quite enough. And I built my whole life around never being that person, around always producing, always proving, always making you proud. And it's taken me until my late 20s to realize what that cost. She was very still. I said, I'm not blaming you. I know you and Dad sacrificed everything. I know the way you raised me came from what your parents taught you about how to make it in the world. I know you love me. I have never doubted that you love me. But the way that love was structured, the way it worked, it taught me that my value was conditional. And I can't keep living from that place. I need to stop. My mother looked at the table. She was quiet for a long moment. When she looked up, her eyes were wet, and she said something I had not expected her to say. She said, My mother never told me she was proud of me once. Not one time. Not the way I needed her to. And I swore I would tell you. I thought I told you. I said, You told me when I earned it. She said, Wasn't that the same thing? I said, very gently, No, Mom, it wasn't. She nodded. She looked at her hands. And then she said, I don't know how to do it the other way. I don't know how to just give it. And right there, in that restaurant, in that admission, I don't know how to just give it, was the most honest thing my mother had ever said to me. More honest than any praise, any criticism, any instruction. Just the bare fact of a woman who had learned love as transaction and had never been taught that it could be anything else, and who had passed that curriculum on to her daughter without ever meaning to cause harm. I reached across the table and put my hand on hers. I said, I know. I think that's what we both need to learn. The inheritance. There is a concept in therapy called the emotional inheritance, the particular patterns and beliefs and wounds that get passed down through families, not through genetics, but through behavior, through atmosphere, through what is rewarded and what is punished, and what is never discussed. I did not choose to inherit conditional love. My mother did not choose to inherit it from her mother. It moved through our family the way certain things move through families, invisibly, in the air, absorbed before you're old enough to question it. Understanding this did not erase the impact. Understanding this did not mean I stopped grieving the childhood I might have had if someone somewhere up the line had learned to give love freely. But it did something important. It took the story out of the register of personal failing and put it into the register of human inheritance. My mother had not withheld warmth because I was unworthy of it. She had withheld it because she had never been taught that warmth was something you gave before it was earned. Because her mother had never given it to her. Because the woman before that, whom I never met, who survived things I cannot imagine, had probably learned the same lesson from a world that was genuinely dangerous. Love as proof of value. Love as the reward for performing your worth. It was very old by the time it got to me. I was just the generation in which it finally became visible. Becoming visible meant it could be examined. Being examined meant it could, with enough work and enough honesty and enough willingness to sit in uncomfortable rooms having difficult conversations, be changed. Not eliminated. I want to be realistic with you. My mother still lights up brighter when I mention a professional success than when I mention a good day. My father still measures love partly in accomplishments, still speaks the language of achievement as a primary love language, and probably always will. These things are true, but they are no longer the whole weather of my relationship with them. They are one part of a more complicated climate that now has other features: curiosity, honesty, the slow, imperfect, genuine effort of two people trying to find a new language for something they've been speaking wrong for a long time. What I stopped doing. I stopped performing. This sounds simple and is, in practice, the most difficult ongoing discipline of my life. I stopped preparing myself for Sunday dinners the way an actor prepares for a role, reviewing my week for achievements worth mentioning, editing out the days that had been hard or unproductive or just ordinary. I started arriving as whatever I actually was that week. Sometimes that was someone with good news. Sometimes it was someone who was tired and said so. My parents are still learning what to do with the tired version. We are all still learning. I stopped making career decisions based on what would read best at the family dinner table. I passed on a senior position that looked impressive from the outside and would have made me miserable from the inside, and I told my parents about this decision after I had made it, and I let my father's silence be his silence, without rushing to fill it with justification. 3 weeks later he said, unprompted, "You know what you're doing," which from him is the equivalent of a standing ovation. I published a piece of writing. A short story in a literary magazine that most people have never heard of, which paid me almost nothing, and which approximately 40 people read. I told my family about it at dinner, and my mother said, "Will you read it to us?" And I did, sitting at their kitchen table in the house I grew up in, reading a story I had written about a woman who was trying to find herself, and my mother sat very still the entire time, and when I finished she said, "You wrote that?" with an expression I had never seen on her before, not proud, exactly, or not only proud, but something more like discovered. Like she had found a room in her own house she hadn't known was there. I started being honest about when I needed something. This is still the hardest one. I was so thoroughly trained to need nothing that needing things feels, even now, like a character flaw I have to argue myself out of. But I am practicing. I told my mother recently that I had had a hard month and I needed her to just listen rather than advise, and she listened, imperfectly but genuinely, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was a revolution disguised as a phone call. What changed and what didn't? My relationship with my parents is not fixed. I want to be precise about this because I think stories about family dynamics have a gravitational pull toward resolution, toward the reconciliation scene, toward the moment when everything clicks and the family becomes the family it was always supposed to be. That has not happened for us. It may never fully happen. These patterns are deep and old, and they don't dissolve in a single honest lunch or even 100 honest lunches. What has changed is the terms. I am no longer available to be the proof of their correct parenting. I am no longer organizing my life around the production of their approval. I am, for the first time in my life, living from the inside out, making decisions based on what I actually want, what I actually value, what actually makes me feel like a full human being rather than a very successful performance of one. My father asked me recently, in a rare moment of directness, whether I was happy. We were on the back porch after dinner, just the two of us, and the question came quietly out of the ordinary conversation the way sometimes true things do. I said yes. He said, "You seem it. You seem more settled than you used to." I said, "I think I am." He said, "Good," and nodded and was quiet, and I knew that was his version of the long conversation. I accepted it as the gift it was. My mother sends me things now. Articles she read. Photos of flowers she thinks are pretty. A recipe she tried and wanted to share. Small dispatches of her ordinary life, offered freely, without agenda or transaction. I think she is practicing. I think she is learning. At 63, a different dialect of love, one that doesn't always require an occasion, that can be sent without earning it first. I receive each one carefully, like something fragile and new that I don't want to spook. Kezia, my cousin, my closest family friend, who watched all of this unfold from the particular vantage point of someone who loves you and is simultaneously relieved not to be you, said to me last year, "You look different. You look like someone who belongs to herself." I belong to myself. That is the whole summary of everything. I spent 27 years belonging to my family's idea of me, and then I stopped, and the stopping was hard and necessary and ongoing. And I belong to myself now, which means I can actually choose to be in relationship with them, freely, without compulsion, without the old desperate need for the warm house, and the choosing makes it real in a way it never was before. What I know about perfect children. If you are reading this and recognizing something in it, something in the folder labeled achievements or the cold house when you got a B+, or the violin lessons you never wanted, I want to say something to you directly. The performance is not who you are. It never was. It was what you learned to do in order to survive a specific emotional climate, and you were very good at it, and that goodness is real, but it is not the whole story. Underneath all the proof you have been generating, there is a person who wanted things and felt things, and was enough before they ever earned a single ribbon. That person did not go anywhere. They have been there the whole time, waiting with extraordinary patience for you to stop running long enough to remember them. Stopping is frightening. I will not pretend otherwise. The first time you let the temperature drop and don't rush to fix it, it feels like everything might freeze. It doesn't.
It just gets cold for a while.
And cold, it turns out you can survive. You have been surviving worse. You have been surviving the slow frostbite of a self that was never allowed to be warm on its own terms. Stop performing. Not all at once. Not with a speech. Just one small decision that is yours instead of theirs, and then another and then another. Build the self from the inside out, and let the family find their way to it. Some will. Some won't. The ones who can find their way to the actual you are worth the whole journey. The ones who only ever wanted the performance, you are allowed to grieve them and let them go. You were enough before you proved it. You have always been enough. I opened a new notebook last month. The old ones were full. 2 years of stories, small and imperfect and entirely mine. I bought a new one, green-covered, blank, and I wrote my name on the inside front cover. Not my accomplishments. Not my titles. Just my name. Elena. Not Elena, who graduated with honors. Not Elena, who never caused problems. Just Elena, who is still learning what she wants, who is still in the process of belonging to herself, who had a mother who loved her in the only way she knew how, and who has decided that the way the story continues is hers to write. That is enough. That is finally more than enough.